Hello everyone, Lisa here. I'm in the process of making a simple block style t-shirt quilt, and I've already prepared with stabilizer and cut out most of the blocks for this quilt. Today I'm using a 15-inch ruler, and when finished my quilt blocks will be 14.5 inches squared. As part of this quilt, I was given a button front shirt with a collar. And this is one of my clients' most favorite shirts, and we want to give the appearance that the whole shirt is added to the quilt. Several of you have asked how I go about adding collars to my quilt blocks, and so I thought I'd bring you along for the process today. So the first thing I do when preparing button front shirts is I go through and tidy up the shirt, buttoning all of the buttons and snapping all of the snaps. Just trying to get the shirt to how it would look as if you were wearing the shirt. Now, one thing I noticed with this shirt is it has a really neat chain on the inside where the tag is. I would love to include that. However, I think that it would be in the seam allowance or it would be too close, adding a difficulty level to this quilt block. The first thing I'm going to do is cut along the top seams and right through the collar of the shirt, from one side all the way to the other. Then I'm going to open this shirt up and cut along the left and right seams, separating the back of the shirt from the front of the shirt. I will save the back for maybe another quilt. Now let's open up this shirt and take a look. Including the collar makes it really appear that you've used the whole shirt. Sometimes what I like to do is take a scrap from another one of the t-shirts and fill in the open area of the collar with another shirt. However, on this quilt block, there is a pocket with an embroidered logo that I'd really love to include in this block. So I'm going to shift the whole square over to the right so I can include a whole pocket and the logo. So you'll see me here. I'm sorry for the glare on the ruler. That's my light up above. It's kind of blinding. Right now I'm just going to figure out where I want to cut out my block. And you'll see a little bit of the collar that would be included if we cut it out just like this. Now you can most certainly center your square if you don't have pockets that you're worried about cutting through. You know, a lot of shirts don't have the pockets. You could fill in at the empty collar area with another shirt or the back of the shirt that you are using. That works just as well. Filling in that square, it would appear that you have a shirt underneath of the shirt. So I just wanted to share that as another option. You can see that this shirt is very stretchy. It is a blend of materials, and so we will be stabilizing the shirt to make it behave while we are sewing the quilt together. I'm going to come in with my ruler one more time and figure out an exact placement for this block and figure out how much collar we want to use in this quilt block. Once we have figured out which parts of the shirt we're going to use in the quilt block, we can bring the shirt over to our pressing surface and be very specific about the placement of our stabilizer. In this quilt, I'm going to be using a Capen P44F fusible interfacing. It is very lightweight and is my favorite interfacing. We can lay everything down nice and flat, and the opening of this shirt is really not wanting to cooperate. So I'm going to bring in some Elmer's glue and run a bead of glue right into the opening of this shirt. And then I'm able to really line up the shirt and make it behave and lay nice and flat. The glue will wash out of your quilt once everything is finished, and so I'm not worried about the glue staying into the quilt. And now we can just lay down everything nice and flat without stretching the shirt too much. You want to try and get out and eliminate any wrinkles. Bringing in my interfacing, I can lay it over the parts of the shirt that I want to use in the quilt. Cover it with a pressing cloth and come in with a iron that is set on a very high cotton setting. And using some steam, I'm going to start on the flat parts of the shirt. Once I feel that those are tacked down really nice and well, I can go in around all of the pockets and the opening of the shirt. Of course, you'll want to use whatever instructions that come with the interfacing that you are using. Once I feel like the stabilizer is good and tacked down, I'm going to turn the shirt over and just make sure that everything is laying nice and flat around the pockets and the opening of the shirt. And then come back with my iron and finish really fusing down that stabilizer. This pocket that I'm ironing here, I'm going to leave open in the quilt, giving them another design feature in their quilt. See how pretty everything is now? Now that the stabilizer has been added, we're ready to cut out our quilt block. On this shirt, I have some metal embellishments on the pocket, and I want to make sure to avoid placing those embellishments in my seam allowance. I'm also going to pay attention to the buttons in the middle of the shirt, making sure that those are not placed in my seam allowance. Now I can come in with my rotary cutter and carefully cut out my quilt block. The seams are very thick and hard to cut through. And pay attention here, I'm cutting towards myself. I would highly recommend that you do not do that. But for this video, the placement of the camera makes it very hard to cut out my quilt blocks. But I always say, do not cut towards yourself with the rotary cutter. We'll finish cutting through those thicker seams, and now we have our quilt block. The next thing we want to do is add the collar, and we want to give the appearance that we've cut our quilt block more towards the top of the shirt. So I'm going to actually bring the collar down lower into my quilt block than the shirt actually was, giving the illusion that I'm using the whole collar in my block. I'm going to cut apart the thicker parts of this collar and play with the placement and give the illusion that I'm using the whole shirt. Next, we want to think about how are we going to make the collar stay there while we sew our quilt together. Let's bring the shirt back over to the pressing surface, and we're going to use some Elmer's school glue to tack down our collar in the exact location of our quilt block. So you can see I'm being very generous with the glue because it all washes out in the end. And just gluing the collar down exactly where I want it in my quilt block. After placing everything down, I'll bring in my iron on a cotton setting and using some steam and really just dry that glue. And this makes it so that I don't have to use pins when I bring this block over to the sewing machine. I really do think that you could use pins as well. After the glue is dry, you can trim off any extra parts of the collar that's not included into your quilt block. And we're going to bring everything over to the sewing machine and sew everything down. We are at the sewing machine now and we're ready to stitch everything down permanently. I have a thread in my bobbin and my top thread that matches the shirt color exactly. So none of the stitching that I'm doing in this part of the process is going to show. I'm going to come in with a zigzag stitch and go all the way around the collar, permanently placing that collar into place. This will make it so that the collar never raises up through the use of the quilt or during the washing process. You'll notice I have a piece of foam book paper underneath my quilt block as a tearaway stabilizer. And this just makes sure that all of my stitches are nice and pretty. We will come in to the second part of the collar and stitch that down. I am not really worried about doing a back stitch along the edges of my quilt block because those will be included in the seam allowance when we piece our blocks together. And just being very careful and going slowly around the collar because it is quite thicker than the rest of our shirt. While we are here, I'm going to stitch down the small little opening of the pocket that we cut on the left side of our block. We won't be using that pocket, and so I'm just going to stitch down the opening. I will do a back stitch when I start the sewing on this small little pocket flap. And sew that right down. And then the next thing I want to do is go ahead and permanently stitch down the opening of the shirt. And to do that, I'm just going to use a straight stitch and sew from one end of the block to the other. All the way down the opening. From one side to the other. And you might have to go slow because this part of the shirt is quite thicker. Once you're done sewing everything down, you can remove any kind of tearaway stabilizers that you've used in the sewing process. You can see I've left this pocket so that you can open and close it, and I really love adding that design element in my quilts whenever possible. So even though we have lowered the actual placement of the collar, by adding the collar, it really brings in the look of the shirt as your client remembers it. Now, when you bring in your blocks to sew together your rows, and once your row is sewn together, when joining your rows together, pay careful, close attention to your collar area, the openings of the shirt, and your pocket areas because those areas are quite thick. And so you're going to want to go very slowly over top of those areas when sewing your quilt top together. But you can see adding the collar really brings in the real look of the shirt and gives the client those memories that they love so much. I really hope that this has helped. Thanks for joining me.